this lesson specifically is on conceptual understanding of the term reflective practitioner. You must have all been hearing about reflective practice, reflecting as a teacher. The NCFTE, National Curriculum Framework for Teacher Education 2009, has titled its document as Preparing a Reflective and Humane Teacher. So, it is to that end that we will be focusing our lesson now on. So, what is reflective practice? Why is reflective practice important in the teaching profession, and how does one become a reflective teacher? So, if we focus on what is reflective practice, it was John Dewey in the early 20th century who popularized the notion of reflective practice in education. And I quote him, "Reflective practice entails decision making in the immediate context." Dewey talks about three kinds of action. One is impulsive action, which is basically based on trial and error. So, something works today, we assume that it will work tomorrow. Routine action, that is traditional ways of doing something. Something has been working for a long period of time, so it will work for me as well. And the third kind of action, he calls it as the reflective action, which basically arises as a need to solve problems. It involves persistence and careful consideration of our own practice. Donald Shawn is another person who brought reflection into the center stage of professional knowledge, and he brought in the terms reflection in action and reflection on action. So, reflection in action, according to Shawn, is something that we do while in action. So, it is the split second decisions that we make and that we reflect on immediately, on the go, as it were. So, reflection on action is something that we do after the completion of an action. So, specifically in the teaching context, reflection in action is deciding what is it that we are going to give a particular student when she asks a question, or a particular student is stuck with the problem. So, how do we help her solve then and there? So, the kind of decisions that we make there, and immediately for us, all this happens within a second. So, within that second we make the decision and immediately we reflect if this decision is the right decision that we have made. So, that is reflection in action. Reflection on action happens after we complete the lesson and sit back and think how the lesson went, where it went wrong, how could it have been better, or where it went right, why did it go right. So, these are the kinds of questions that frames reflection on action. Van Menen is another educator who is given a hierarchy of reflective practice. The hierarchy is like this: technical, practical and critical. So, technical, what I just told you now, what went right, what went wrong and why. The practical kind of reflective practice focuses on examining interpretive assumptions about our own work. So, how do we interpret the kinds of assumptions based on which we make the decisions? That is the practical aspect of the reflective practice. Critical aspect comes in when we critically reflect on the ethical dimensions of the educational objectives and means of achieving them. So, this, according to Van Menen, is the highest hierarchy of reflective practice, where we critically question the very objectives with which we are teaching. The National Curriculum Framework 2009 has said that reflective practice is the central aim of teacher education, and it defines reflective practice as being integrative and eclectic, open and flexible and not prescriptive, liberal and humanistic, emphasizing dialogical explorations instead of didactic communication, as I am doing now. Now, why is reflective practice important? Before we go into that, I would like to narrate a small story. This was written by Rabindranath Tagore almost 100 years back, but in some sense still holds good in our society. So, the story is about a parrot. This parrot was, as all birds do, it was freely flying around in the palace orchard, and the king saw the parrot flying, and he decided the parrot needs education because it's just flying around wasting its time, and he felt that it has to be properly groomed and educated. And the king's wish is the courtier's command, so they capture the parrot, put the parrot in a golden cage because it is the king who has ordered for capturing the parrot. And then the courtiers start making arrangement to educate the parrot. So, they call in experts, the experts prepare a curriculum, and the experts prepare a set of people who would be with the parrot on a regular basis and teach the curriculum to the parrot, and they bring in a whole lot of books that are necessary for this teaching to happen. And after a month or so, the king comes on a visit to see how well the parrot is progressing. So, all these experts are lined up to receive the king, and they have made piles of these books beside the cage. So, the king comes and sees, and he is quite happy with all the arrangements that is made. And needless to say, the king is welcomed with big musical extravaganza. There are cymbals playing, there are pipes that are playing, and there are these experts who are telling out their curriculum loudly, and the other set of experts who explain to the teacher, to the king, how is it that they teach the parrot. So, a grand show is put up for the king. So, he is quite happy with all the arrangements that is made, and he starts to walk back. Then somewhere a small voice is heard from among the crowd. King, did you take a look at the parrot? And the king suddenly realized, yes, I have not seen the parrot, I only saw the arrangements that are being made. And he goes near the parrot, and the parrot is lying down lifeless inside the cage. So, again, what does this show? It is a parody of the schooling system that Tagore has very beautifully put across in the form of a story. Again, the sad part is that after 100 years, to an extent, this still holds good. So, this is where reflection is crucial. We all have to reflect as practitioners, what is it that we need to do so that the education that we are giving our children is meaningful. So, basically the purpose of reflective practice is to help teachers and everybody else associated with education to become aware of their thoughts and actions, evolve a collective praxis, and bring in plurality of choices center stage. because education is by nature complex. So, there are multiple choices that we will be making at multiple levels. So, we need to be aware of these choices, and we need to ensure that these choices are kept alive. We cannot choose one set and exclude the other because of the dynamic and the complex nature of education. So, the purpose of reflective practice is primarily to help teachers and educators develop insight into our own practice, discern among competing ideas, and be able to choose that which suits us and our context, and developing caring dispositions. So, in all our relationships, be it with our peers, be it with the higher ups, most importantly with the learners, it is important that we develop caring attitudes. Now, how does one become a reflective teacher? Just by sitting back and constantly thinking about what we are doing, does that make us a reflective practitioner? That is one, of course, constantly we can't sit back and think, but that is one aspect to becoming a reflective practitioner. Primarily, what is of importance for teachers is that we should form, teachers or teacher educators for that matter, we should form networks, academic networks. So, communities of practice is what is of crucial importance for a profession like teaching, because of the dynamic nature that it presents. So, such a network will provide social and shared elements, which are again important to develop as reflective practitioners and help us sustain that those kinds of reflections all through our career. This is especially important in a profession like teaching, because we do not have any final knowledge, as it were, that can be handed over to us, that this is it, you follow this and your problems will be solved. So, that kind of finality of knowledge that we have, say, in the physical sciences, that is not possible in education, because we are primarily dealing with humans. Humans are by nature vibrant, they are by nature diverse, and hence the knowledge that deals with humans also reflects that kind of dynamism and the lack of finality. So, it is in this context that the teaching profession requires reflection. So, some of the ways in which we could promote reflective practice, starting from the colleges of education, is to have dialogues, is to have narratives, and make meaning through interpretations. So, for example, you all told me you just observed a few classes, schools and came. So, how is it that you are interpreting? A group of you may have gone to the same school, but how you interpret the context within the school and the experiences within the school will depend on your own experiences and on the ideas that you carry. So, how you interpret those experiences becomes important if you share them amongst yourselves as a group. Then you will know the kind of lens that you are using to interpret the experiences that you take away from. Maintaining reflective journals is very important for educators, both teachers and teacher educators. Engaging in practitioner research or action research is again a very important tool as reflective practitioners, and more than all these things, being open to ideas and developing the ability to think independently and critically are at most qualities that a teacher will have to hone up within herself. The National Curriculum Framework for Teacher Education 2009 envisages a humanistic and liberal teacher education program with reflective practice as its central aim. The teacher education programs, both pre-service and in-service programs that are happening in our country, will have to gear themselves as reflective practices, not have reflection as a course of study or have reflection as an activity, but the programs themselves should emerge as reflective practices in terms of thinking through deeply what works, what doesn't work, why something works, and making connections between the different aspects of the program is crucial. If the program themselves have to emerge as reflective practices. So, at the same time, teacher education programs should take care that they do not co-opt into simplistic paradigms of effective, efficient kind of discourse, if the program has to maintain their philosophical autonomy. Reflective practice is highly complex and it needs ethical, philosophical, conceptual and empirical explorations.
Ma'am, my question is that how this reflective practice will be helpful in a class of nearly 60 to 70 students. I mean, nowadays we find the schools where there are even 100 students in a class. So, it would be okay when the number of students in the class is 30 or 40, but how would it be helpful when the students are more than that?
A very pertinent question. If you are talking about the strength in schools, then as per the RTE Act 2009, schools are not supposed to have those many students, one. And two, it is particularly important for a teacher who is having to deal with so many students to reflect. I agree, when the strength is so large, then reflection in action that Sean talked about while you are teaching, while you are engaging children becomes a challenge. But reflection on action can certainly happen. Large number of students does not preclude us from reflecting subsequently after we transact a lesson.
Hello ma'am. Ma'am, you were saying there were different ways for this reflective thinking, ma'am, and that can be incorporated in a classroom. And there you mentioned that dialogue is one of the ways by which you can implement this. Can you please elaborate on that particular topic, ma'am?
Yeah, thank you. This dialogue is again a pretty tricky idea. It needs unpacking. See, the dialogue that I used in the presentation specifically referred to dialogues that teachers can have among their own peers. But dialogue also forms a, I think your question stems from there, dialogue also forms a important pedagogic tool within classroom. Dialogue does not mean just a one-on-one dialogue between a teacher and a student or between two students. Dialogue in the sense of the philosopher Martin Buber, for example, has a much larger connotation. So, dialogue involves articulating ideas. So, there is this general assumption that dialogues are possible in a language class, but in a science class or a mathematics class, where is the scope for dialogue? There is definitely scope for dialogue. So, if we conflate dialogue as talk, in a science class for example, you conduct an experiment and the assumption is that once children see the demo of the experiment or once children do the experiment for themselves, they understand the concept. but studies after studies show us that this is not the case. In a very famous video that was done with Harvard graduates, mind you, Harvard is a very well-known university in the entire country. It ranks among the top universities. A journalist had asked these graduates a very simple question of how seasons are formed, and these are non-science majors, but they have studied science at some point in their undergraduate level, and none of them were able to give a scientific explanation of this phenomenon of formation of seasons. So, by conducting experiment or by studying, we do not really learn the scientific explanation. To give example from the science class, it applies to other subjects as well. So, this is where dialogue or talk plays a very important role. So, again taking the science example, you conduct an experiment and you allow children to share their thoughts, their ideas of what the experiment communicated to them or what they thought they conducted the experiment for. So, that is when their alternate conceptions, as it is called, come to the fore, and a discussion can ensue around that, and an explanation that is closer to the accepted canons of science can be evolved through discussions within the classroom. The same thing applies in mathematics as well. Algorithmically, children may be doing the problems correctly, but they may not have a conceptual understanding of why they are doing. For example, something as simple as borrowing in a 2-digit addition. They may not know why they are borrowing, they may just blindly borrow. But giving an opportunity for children to talk about what they have done, to discuss the process they used in solving a particular problem, will go a long way in bringing to fore their alternate conceptions. So, that is when as a teacher you will know the thinking process that is going on behind children, and you would be able to certainly not supply answers, because we know that by supplying answers children do not take the answer and learn that particular concept, but giving them opportunities to correct their alternate conceptions towards a more scientifically or mathematically or whatever discipline that you are teaching, towards an understanding that falls within the canons of that particular discipline. In this lesson, we have seen very briefly what is reflective practice and why reflective practice is important for a teacher, and how can one become a reflective practitioner. So, there is no magic wand with which we suddenly become reflective. So, it is a process that we develop as we go along in our profession, but it is very important that we start building the foundation for reflection early on in our profession. So, that is when you are student teachers. So, do start maintaining your reflective journals and take them seriously, and ensure that you continue with this practice even when you become teachers. Thank you.